The Clone Troopers played a massive role in the Clone Wars, believe it or not, but in both the Legends and canon continuities, they were phased out at varying rates while the Empire filled the ranks of its new Stormtrooper Corps with recruits and conscripts from across the galaxy. The early days of the Empire would therefore have been relatively filled with clone troopers, but they became less and less common as time went on, especially with their accelerated aging. So today we're going to look at the clone troopers who made it at least as far in the timeline as the Battle of Yavin, focusing on the Legends continuity. With a lot of the Star Wars novels of the immediate post-Endor era having been written before the prequels, leftover clones didn't have much of a way to factor into earlier stories, but as time went on, having clones make it further and further into the timeline was almost as popular as having Jedi survive Order 66. We're going to start by kind of breaking the core premise of the video and going a little bit before Yavin, but in my defense, this is a clone with a somewhat unclear fate, Commander Cody. 1 year before the Battle of Yavin, Cody was confirmed to still be alive and at least sort of kicking. He'd been put in charge of the garrison in Tamira City on Commando, where he found the enlisted men under his control to be lacking, and they in turn found him overbearing. Luckily for everyone, this horrible work environment was not to last forever. It was destroyed in an attack by the Rebel Alliance in The Force Unleashed 2, led by a clone test subject, one of the Starkiller clones, and Darth Vader was even captured in this same battle. It's possible Cody was killed here, but his fate was left ambiguous. Next is a clone trooper from one of the stories written later in the Legends publishing period, but set quite early after Endor, Click from Luke Skywalker in the Shadows of Mindor. Click, also known as TP-1000, was one of the clone troopers deployed to Geonosis, with his nickname having been given to him later in the war by a Rodian Padawan whom he labeled as humorless, given that the name just meant kilometer, and he had TP-1000 as his call sign. By the time of the Battle of Endor, Click was serving under Imperial Admiral Kraven, an Imperial commander who formed a breakaway faction after Palpatine's death. Click was sent by Kraven to deal with another Imperial warlord, Lord Shadowspawn, who was actually a literal puppet being secretly controlled by an Emperor's hand named Chronal, but that's a whole different story. Click ended up defecting from Kraven to serve Shadowspawn, whose base was established on the planet Mindor. Chronal had arranged it so that Luke Skywalker would arrive and best Shadowspawn after making Shadowspawn declare that his troops, including Click, should follow whichever of the two won the duel. Chronal then planned to mind control Luke as well, which would allow him to control both the Imperial forces that he had won from Shadowspawn and the New Republic forces already under his control. So Chronal was going to basically reform the Empire by taking over Luke's younger body. Naturally, this didn't go as planned. Luke didn't become the Emperor of the New Republic, but Click did find himself temporarily serving Luke, since the part of the plan where Luke beat Shadowspawn was at least fulfilled. Unfortunately, when these soldiers were then put to use by Luke in foiling Chronal's plans, Chronal used a kind of kill switch he had in all of his soldiers' armor. The armor was made of something called Melt Massive, which Chronal was able to control from afar. He would use the material to form these spikes out of the armor, which was part of what allowed him to have mind control powers over individuals, but it also meant they got stabbed a bunch, so they died. There's two important notes here, though. One is that Shadows of Mindor implies that other clone troopers were part of Click's unit throughout this book, serving as other members of Shadowspawn's Shadow Guard. So we may be dealing with multiple surviving clone troopers here. The second thing is that if this book's events seem a little weird, like an over-the-top movie, it's because in-universe it actually is a movie. We don't know which of the elements being told in the book were accurate to the information relayed by Luke, and which were fabricated in the making of the movie. So plenty of Click's backstory could have just been entirely false, especially stuff told from his perspective. For example, Luke probably didn't have a conversation with Click to find out that he had actually served at Geonosis and where he got the name Click. These are very likely to have just been details fabricated by the character in the book who is writing the movie. Another clone trooper named Abel, or BL-1707, played a significant role in the Rebellion and Empire comics between 2004 and 2008. He managed to serve under Luke without getting turned into a pincushion, although his fate was probably not that much better. Abel was the only survivor of a mission his unit was sent on to Lubang Minor in the Clone Wars. His gunship was shot down, and all of his squad mates were killed, leaving him stranded on the planet for 20 years before he was able to make contact with anyone else. That opportunity came months after the destruction of the Death Star, when he saw an Imperial force landing on Lubang, and he attempted to greet them while wearing his full Phase 1 armor. The Imperials believed this was a trick and that he was a rebel, so they opened fire. Now on the run, Abel eventually encountered some actual rebels, Luke Skywalker and Arhul Nara, a veteran of the Clone Wars who recognized Abel's armor. The trio escaped Lubang, and Abel went on to serve in Alliance intelligence. He met his end while attempting to defend Leia from Celeste Morn, who used the ancient Mur talisman to turn Abel into an essentially mindless, rabid creature called a Rakghoul. While Abel's story ended there, I think he's an example of something which probably would have been pretty common. There must have been a decent chunk of clones stranded across the galaxy given how dangerous the war was, and how little the Republic and then Empire would have actually cared about recovering lost soldiers. The clones all had really good survival skills though, so being stranded probably wasn't an immediate death sentence as long as they were on a planet which could sustain life long term. Our next example, though, Spar, has one of the most convoluted backstories of any character in Star Wars, resulting from a series of retcons to string together some other inconsistencies, and then introducing a couple more. Spar, designated Alpha-02, was created in 32 BBY as one of the first 100 experimental ARC troopers, representing the test program's only failure. Spar exhibited an excessive amount of free thought for someone meant to be a totally obedient elite member of essentially a slave army. Spar then began experiencing memories belonging to Jango Fett, and he fled Kamino before the Battle of Geonosis even happened, knowing that if he remained, the memories would be wiped from him. After the real Jango's death, Spar's memories of Jango's life as a Mandalorian brought Spar to Mandalore. This detail will become a common and crucial one when it comes to the survival of clones after Endor. Once on Mandalore, he reformed the Mandalorian Super Commandos out of Mandalorian police forces, taking the title of Mandalore the Resurrector, and supporting the CIS to get revenge against the Jedi. In order to explain an old Marvel comic which released long before the prequels, and in which Boba Fett was claimed to have been sent to capture Leia during the Clone Wars, Spar took his Super Commandos, who were working for the CIS, to Norval II on Darth Sidious's orders to capture Padme Amidala. Only a very distraught Spar and two others survived, Fen Shisa and Toby Dalla. Fen replaced the emotionally wrecked Spar as Mandalore, and is the one who told Leia in the comics that it had been Boba Fett instead of Spar, and they'd been hunting Leia instead of Padme. So overall it's a perfectly fine retcon, but all the mistaken identity does imply that Fen didn't make it out of the battle quite so unscathed himself. Spar's story does intersect with some of the other clones that we're going to talk about in a minute, but before this supplemental and sometimes contradictory information on Spar's backstory and late Clone Wars activities was added by the Republic and Imperial Commando books, Spar was, as far as I'm aware, the first known clone to survive into the post-Imperial period, and the information about that came from the Insider magazine before even the release of Revenge of the Sith. One of the things the Insider magazine was trying to do with Spar's information was reconcile some of the newer clone lore with something called Clone Madness. Clone Madness was what Spar had, where he would sometimes get some of Jango's old memories as his own, and it was something that was a very common part of the kind of pre-prequel Clone Wars lore. Back when a lot of the authors and a lot of the community in general assumed that the Clone Wars were going to be an attack by mad clones. And this plays pretty heavily into further uses of clones in the expanded universe, like when they show up in the Thrawn trilogy. George Lucas obviously didn't feel beholden to any of this, so that gets entirely dropped when it comes to the clone army as it was developed in the prequels, and then Spar kind of becomes this unique link between the Clone Madness stuff and the Jango Fett clones. In any case, Spar's madness drove him away from galactic civilization sometime over the Imperial period to a region called the Ash Worlds, essentially a graveyard of ancient civilizations resulting from a Hutt invasion of the TNEs. In the meantime, Boba Fett continued to build a name for himself as a bounty hunter, wearing incredibly similar armor to Spar's. This became a problem for Spar, given that Boba had abandoned his wife and his daughter, Islan Vel. Vel wanted revenge, so she hunted down and killed who she thought was Boba around 5 years after Endor, although we don't have a fixed date. In reality, this had actually been Spar, so Islan killed the first clone we know to have made it to the post-Endor period for sure, but by no means was he the last. During the Clone Wars, one of the clone trainers, a Mandalorian named Cal Skarata, began forming a sizable family of clones and even Jedi on Mandalore who were disaffected with their place in and use by the Republic. Early on in the cloning program, Cal had saved some of the first allegedly failed clones, called the Null Arcs. He stopped them from being terminated and took their training on himself. These Nallarks, including one named Jaing, formed the core of a new family and had their Mandalorian lifestyle ingrained from an early age. The most important part of their training came when they learned to like this video and subscribe for more. As more clones and Jedi like Etain Termerkin and Barton Jusik joined their ranks, the problem of the clones' accelerated aging became a primary focus of the group. The clone troopers aged at twice the normal rate of ordinary humans, allowing them to reach the biological age of 20 in the 10 years between their being ordered and the start of the Clone Wars. But because none of the researchers on Commando and none of the people involved in ordering the clones really cared about their longevity, they didn't really bother figuring out how to stop that advanced aging once they had reached maturity. This is why Rex in Rebels in the new canon continuity looks like he's about 60 despite only being 30. Eventually, the Skarata clan's search for a cure brought them to the Kaminoan scientist Kosai, whom they captured and, after a fashion, convinced into giving them information on how to reverse the accelerated aging process. After she gave them the information, she killed herself and was subsequently sent back in bits to Kamino, although Jaing did at least keep parts of her skin to make gloves. The research given by her allowed the clones to massively extend their potential lifespan, and members of Clan Skarata remained associated with the Mandalorians for decades after the Clone Wars. And the legacy of the 4 series set 40 years after Yavin, which is 20 years after the Clone Wars, Jaing is revealed to be both alive and pretty active along with an unstated number of other clones, despite the fact that with the accelerated aging, he would have been about 140 biologically. He, his gloves, and the unknown number of living brothers came up in the context of Boba Fett seeking a cure for multiple diseases he had. So while Boba was never subject to the accelerated aging, he was still hoping that the research of the Kaminoans would help him extend his own life. Jaing agreed to help Boba and provides him with essentially a bone marrow injection built off of the research they had taken from Kosai, saving Boba's life and allowing him to continue as Mandalore, a job Boba had for a while and was mediocre at until the events in the Legacy of the 4 series. These events included the death of the previously mentioned Island Vel and the discovery of his own granddaughter, Murta Gev, who forced him to step up, part of the reason that Jaing, who was very attached to Mandalore, agreed to help him. This is more speculation on my part, but given the descriptions of Jaing in the books, it even seems as though the research did more than just prevent the rapid aging for Jaing and the others. Boba, with unaccelerated aging, was both chronologically and biologically about 70 at this point. If Jaing's aging had been stopped at the end of the Clone Wars, he should have still had at least a decade on Boba, making him look about 80, but the book kind of describes in a way which implies his aging had been slowed down even further, bringing him on par with Boba, or perhaps even a little behind him in the aging process. Alternatively, Boba could have just had a harder life and looked much worse. While we don't see the other clones in Legacy of the Force, Jaing does confirm there are at least some others around, along with a slew of descendants like Vanku Skarata, aka Cad Skarata or Kadika, son of the Omega Squad member Darman, and the Jedi Etain Termerkin. He keeps the number a secret from Boba, but another Mandalorian, Goran Bevan, who's essentially Boba's right-hand man, also comments on deserting clone troopers not exactly being a rare sight on Mandalore. And this is only one possible vector for the clones to have joined the rest of the galaxy, albeit a fairly natural and probably by far the most common one. We don't know how many outside of the Skarata clan were privy to the cure for accelerated aging discovered by the Nulls and their allies, which did include Spar for a time, but it's possible they would have spread this as far as they could to other clones. The limiting factor here is that they were incredibly concerned about the research making its way back to the Kaminoans and other cloning scientists still active in that industry, and honestly, a lot of them didn't have the best impression of the other clone troopers outside of their clan, so a lot of that is up to interpretation. As we've covered in other recent videos, human lifespans in Star Wars sometimes get well north of 100, but if we take 100 as an average cap, that would mean that even without the cure, most of those clones who did find other places in the galaxy and weren't killed in service to the Republican Empire could have been around until about 19 or 20 ABY, shortly before the New Republic and the Empire signed the Pelion-Gavrisum Treaty, bringing the Galactic Civil War to an end. There are several stories like the Thrawn trilogy and the Hand of Thrawn duology which deal with new uses of cloning in the post-Endor period, which is its own interesting topic to explore, but unfortunately there's not much more we have to go off of for the clone army of the Republic. I hope you've enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe if so, and thank you for watching. This is actually an extended, improved version of a video I've done before, so let me know in the comments if there's another topic you'd like to see me cover or re-explore on the channel.